Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Blair Maffris.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank Taylor for this opportunity to be the commencement speaker this year and to extend my congratulations to all the parents and families and the class of 2015. Your accomplishments as individuals and collectively as a group. Your graduation marks the end of your tenure as Webb School students, and it is an achievement to be proud of. These young men just returned on Wednesday from their hike into and out of the Grand Canyon. The hike that the class of 2015 recently completed is a long-held tradition that had its beginnings with our esteemed Dr. Ray Alf, I believe back in the mid-1930s, when he took a group of Webb boys to the Grand Canyon to collect fossil tracks and trackways of small-sized Permian reptiles that lived about 250 million years ago. From that initial trip, Ray Alf started to lead annual spring breaks fossil collecting expeditions that consisted of a circular route that had stops at Seligman, Grand Canyon, Cameron Junction, Kanab, Zion, and Death Valley. This only may be a legend, but I've been told that every time they would go to the Grand Canyon to excavate those fossils, way back in those days, the boys hiked the long, arduous route down and out of the canyon by themselves, to be greeted at the top by Ray Alf. Things have changed. I believe that it was in May of 1961 that the first official senior trip to the Grand Canyon took place. Chris Reynolds' class of 1961 is credited with the idea, and thus began the tradition. And I'm not exactly sure what the motivation was for this decision to have this grueling hike as a culmination of the Webb experience, but I will venture a guess, a point that I'll get to a little later. What I do know now is that from 1961 until the late 90s, an unbroken string of Webb senior classes made the hike accompanied by a group of faculty to mark the climax of their experience as Webb students. I also know that the many men who have completed the experience have a common connection to each other because they have walked the same trails that lead into and out of the canyon. It links them together because of a shared experience. So we have to thank Dr. Alf and Chris Reynolds for starting this great tradition. During the early and mid-90s, every time we took a group to the Grand Canyon, without exception, we would be visited at least once the day prior to the hike by a ranger who would inform us that it was dangerous and not a good idea to be leading boys into the canyon. Although they could not stop us, they made strong attempts to dissuade us. The Forest Service, of course, had no idea of the preparation the leaders of the trip took each year to make sure that every boy was prepared for the challenge and that we as faculty were mindful of the dangers encountered along the way. Having a generation of boys complete this challenge in the past, we knew what we were doing. Prior to the hike in those days, the seniors underwent rigorous preparation that included conditioning leading up to a strenuous, fast-paced ascent of Mount Baldy, which is 10,000 feet. In addition to the practice hikes, there are also numerous short talks about the importance of proper hydration, wearing appropriate clothing, foot care, eating on the trail, and all the dangers, things like water toxicity, which is drinking too much water. Experienced faculty members, a few of whom were trained in outdoor first aid, always accompany the boys. We also carried radios in some years. The boys hiked down the Bright Angel Trail and out the Kaibab Trail, and in other years, they hiked down the Kaibab and out the Bright Angel Trail. The Grand Canyon has its hikes, has its dangers, and it is definitely one of the most strenuous hikes in our national park system. From the top of the trail, one cannot see the bottom as it proceeds in a series of what seems like endless switchbacks. If a hiker is not prepared for the conditions on the trail and enters the canyon with false confidence, without enough water, food, and knowledge of conditions on the trail, and if they are out of shape, trouble is almost guaranteed. Unfortunately, this is the case with many hikers who attempt the journey on an almost daily basis during the peak tourist season. Bravado has no place on this trail. Inexperienced people who get into trouble in the Grand Canyon just don't know what they're getting themselves into. It is understandable that by 1997, the Forest Service had become very aggressive with their attempts to deter us from making this hike. Because the Forest Service was so determined to prevent us from making this hike, we began to question whether or not doing the trip was prudent and worth all the trouble. So as a result, in 1998, Webb decided to cease the Grand Canyon trip for seniors. And for a few years, we attempted a number of alternative options. One senior class, led by Jim Daler, went to the Havasupai Indian Reservation and dodged horses as they hiked into the canyon that joins the Colorado, to one of the most spectacular and beautiful places in the Southwest. Another trip was to the Sequoia area, where the boys encountered a freak snowstorm and rain that ended the trip early. A third excursion was a relaxing sojourn centered at El Capitan. That's right where we just had that oil spill just north of Santa Barbara, where we spent days riding bicycles and kayaking along the coast. Greg Lawson was the dean of students around that time, and he managed to find an experience kayaking along the Colorado River on the Black Canyon River trips. All these alternative trips were very cool, and they had elements that did challenge the boys, both physically and mentally along the way. However, in the opinion of many, there really was nothing in them that could rival the experience of the hike in and out of the Grand Canyon in a single day. Although challenging, they somehow lacked something. In 2003, I was asked to be lead class advisor, and one day in September over lunch, Greg Lawson and I began to talk about the Grand Canyon hike and what an incredible experience it was for everyone who partook of the adventure. We decided that I should approach Susan Nelson, head of schools, to get her opinion about revisiting the canyon. She was excited about the idea and gave her approval to investigate some way of possibly restarting the tradition. I immediately went to talk to Greg, and over the next couple of weeks, we decided that during the Thanksgiving break, we would make a trip to work out the logistics for the Grand Canyon trip that year. So over the break, we headed to Williams and began to explore the area for possible campsites, places to stop for meals, and things to do that would help to make the trip enjoyable, but also accomplish the purpose of the journey. We realized from the outset that it would be difficult to have 50 or so boys heading out from the trailhead at one time, which is what was done prior to 97. So we studied the trail maps and realized that if we split the class into 3 groups, it would be possible to hike in smaller units that could all meet at a designated spot along the trail and then hike out as a class. We timed the drives from the campground to the drop-off points to determine when it would be the best time to do the group departures. By doing this, we could tailor the hikes to fit individual students and faculty more effectively, making the experience well suited for everyone. Studying the trails, we decided on 3 routes taken by 3 groups, each departing at different times and meeting at the Indian Gardens sometime around noon. The first group would hike down the Kaibab Trail all the way to the bottom, rest for a short period, and hike out using the Bright Angel Trail. The second group would hike down the Kaibab to the Tonto Plateau, across a section of the Tonto Trail to the Bright Angel Trail, and then to the Indian Gardens, a hike that has very little shade. A third group would hike down the Bright Angel Trail to the Tonto Point and hike back up to the Indian Gardens, a shorter but very tough descent and ascent. Meeting at the Indian Gardens, the boys would then begin the final ascent as a group. Visualize standing at the tip of Mather Point on the south rim. You can glimpse the outer and inner canyons below. And way down in the inner canyon, you can just see a sliver of the river and the Phantom Ranch. Across from you is the north rim. To your left, you can see the Bright Angel Trail, Indian Gardens, and the trail out to Tonto Point. Looking down and to your right, you can see the Kaibab Trail as it snakes its way down towards the outer rim and then disappears descending along the inner rim to the river below. When hiking the Kaibab, there's no water along the way, and the guys have to carry at least a gallon of water to sustain them. They also bring along plenty to eat, and I think that the first really great view on the Kaibab is at a spot called Ooh Ah Point. That's what you think when you see the view from there. From this location, the class hikes down and on to the first place hikers stop at, called Cedar Ridge, which is 1.5 miles from the starting point. From here, they proceed down and out towards the rim of the outer canyon. Skeleton Point is the next milestone, roughly another mile and a half from here. There are incredible views of the Outer Canyon and the Tonto Plateau. It isn't long before the group splits. One group will take the Tonto Trail, which is a long dusty stretch of trail along the bottom of the canyon. Here the trail is exposed along this whole expanse to intense sun. The guys heading to the inner canyon hike on to a spot called Top Off and to the next stretch of the trail, which is the trek in the inner canyon. They walk along. This last stretch of trail is about 4 miles to the bottom. Here the trail steepens and there are more switchbacks along the section of trail. And at the bottom, the Kaibab suspension bridge awaits where the guys cross the river. It's a pretty cool bridge. It's kind of like something you'd find in the Indiana Jones movie. After crossing the river, they walk along the banks of the Colorado until they reach the Phantom Ranch. And at the Phantom Ranch, there's shade, and there's a stream, there's fresh water, and it's a good place to soak your feet. And if you soak your feet there, you walk in the stream, these little fish come and they kind of nibble at your toes. It's a real weird feeling, but it's kind of cool. It's a good place to recharge and rest. So the inner canyon can be very hot, so you don't want to linger too long there, although it's really tempting to do so. With high temperatures, there is just enough time to rest a bit before the boys begin the ascent up the Bright Angel Trail. Leaving Phantom Ranch, the guys hike a distance along the north bank of the Colorado to the Bright Angel Suspension Bridge, where they cross the river again and to the south bank. If it's a hot day, this section can take a lot out of you. And the next stretch of the trail is this slog in sand for about 1.5 miles. It's awful. To where the trail begins to ascend the south rim through a section I always thought is called the Devil's Corkscrew. In the past, I've seen rattlesnakes along this section of the trail. The top of the canyon is over 5,000 vertical feet above you. For the group of guys who hike to the bottom, the climb out of the canyon actually begins here. And for another 1.5 miles or so, the trail is twisty, steep, and by late morning, the canyon walls are beginning to radiate heat. They hike on, and once the boys reach Indian Gardens, they find a small bit of paradise. Tall cottonwood trees, a stream, and ample places to kick off your boots, rest, eat something, and drink plenty of cool water. Webb always rests here a good long time to recharge and get ready for the remainder of the hike. And sometime after lunch, as you head out and walk up the hot, dusty, gently descending trail from Indian Gardens, it doesn't take long before you realize that it's going to be a long, usually hot trip back up to the top of the rim. Once the boys leave the Indian Gardens, the trail ascends steeply in a seemingly endless series of switchbacks all the way to the top. It's quite a climb, but fortunately there is water at 2 spots on the way up, so it isn't necessary to carry as much water as you did on the way down. Gradually, as one climbs out, the views begin to change, and as you ascend through the incredible geology of the canyon, it's an amazing journey through time. I always find it humbling. As you near the top, you pass through a couple of arches carved through the rock of the canyon wall, and at the first one you get a sense that the journey is almost over. You get glimpses of the rim above, and it lifts your spirits and lightens your load. And for some reason, I find myself picking up my pace at the first tunnel. And it isn't long before you reach the rim and hear your waiting friends cheering you on. You made it. Arriving at the top, near the Grand Tover Hotel, you have hiked nearly 10 miles from the bottom and gained over 5,000 feet of elevation. It's been a long but unforgettable day. On the hike, every person copes in his own way. On the way down, there seems to be a lot more conversation than on the way up. Everyone walks fast on the way down. Gravity works. It is on the way up that the hurried pace of the descent becomes a more measured rate of speed, and each person travels at his own pace. The rabbits move more quickly, while the rest of us move more slowly. Arriving at Indian Gardens, most people are pretty tired. The departure from Indian Gardens is in full sun, as is much of the trail on the ascent from there. It is the hot, dusty little stretch of the hike just as you leave Indian Gardens that I have always found most testing. Having rested a bit, it's mentally difficult to maintain the momentum that you had earlier. This is where the real grind begins. There is only one way out, up. And it isn't long until you are missing those cool trees back at Indian Gardens. Mule trains on their way to and from the Tonto Point cause one to have to step aside as they pass. They also leave a mess on the trail, breaking your concentration and making it difficult to get into a flow. The wooden steps that are meant to stabilize the trail also break your rhythm, as they are varied in their height and placement. Dust can be a problem, so often you have to wait for groups to pass or step aside for fast hikers, or worse yet, get stuck behind some old guy like me creeping up the canyon. Groups leapfrog each other, encouraging each other and grabbing a little shade to rest in when they can find it. It's the last 6 miles or so that can test you on this hike, and it is for everyone a tough go. Like many of my fellow faculty, I have hiked the canyon a few times, and I have a love-hate relationship with it. The canyon tests me each and every time I hike it, but I love it. Each experience is unique, and each trip amazes me because on the trail, there's always something that happens that is miraculous to me. Usually it is a demonstration of character that I would have not even anticipated. One year, Webb's group was instrumental in assisting in 5 rescues, helping by sharing water, food, and administering first aid to 5 separate individuals until help arrived, one of which was life-saving. There are also small individual revelations that happen. A few years back, we had a young man who during his tenure at Webb had the reputation of being a bit of a loner and also of being a bit self-centered and seemingly unwilling to get along with his classmates. His circle of friends was a kid from off campus, and in his dealings with Webb students, he kept his distance. I don't think that he was too excited about going on his senior trip, but on the bus he started to open up a bit. And I was worried that he would have a difficult time on the hike because he wasn't very enthusiastic about physical activity and he had a reputation of avoiding it however he could. I personally expected problems from him, but as it turned out, during the couple of days preceding the hike, he seemed to be finding his way and finally after 4 years was beginning to fit in. Actually, it was on the hike where I personally witnessed something in him that I will always remember, and it consisted of his kindness toward other hikers on the trail, his classmates, and myself. Having hiked as far as the second water spot on the hike up from Indian Gardens, I was feeling pretty tired. Sweeping can be very tiring because the slower pace can grind you down because you're exposed to more dust on the trail and the sun, and as sweepers, you always have to kind of keep the pack moving up the trail. Although being one of the sweepers can be tough physically, it is also very rewarding because that is often where the magic happens. I must admit that when I reached the second water spot on my way out, I probably looked really tired. The water spots are a good place to take a rest out of the sun and drink some cool water and fill up water bottles before pushing on toward the top. I remember that on this one occasion, I had to wait a while before I could even find a place to sit in the shade. And when I managed to find a seat, it was right across from this kid whom I'll call Michael. I smiled and asked him, "How's it going?" And he replied, "Fine," and we shared some small talk and encouragement. We both decided to head up the trail at the same time, and I must have looked a mess because as I started to get up, he asked me if he could carry my pack. And it was mind-blowing to me because I would never have expected that thoughtfulness given my prior experiences with him. I thanked him and I carried my own pack, but for me, that one instance made the whole trip. What is wonderful about the Grand Canyon hike is that every time our seniors make this journey, it is marked by countless little demonstrations like this one that make evident our boys' selflessness, kindness, and generosity. They exhibit these qualities not just to their classmates, but to other people hiking the trail. That trail somehow works its magic, and it is this spirit of goodness that epitomizes the trip. Seniors, I'm quite sure that your trip, your journey into and out of that great hole in the ground is marked by moments like I just described. On your last night together as a class at Halapai, you participated in a ceremony that was originated by one of Webb's greatest teachers, and his name is Steve Patterson. On every one of the hikes that I made with Steve, he was always the last man out of the canyon. Not because he was the slowest person, but because he was such a good man. He always put others ahead of himself and was humble and incredibly kind, and a caring individual who was loved by his students. He set an example of how to be a man through his actions and was truly a wonderful soul. On the last night of the trip, while he was still alive, we passed around a ball, and in each of us would get a chance to speak our minds and feelings regarding our Webb experience. And it is Steve Patterson's ceremony that I always find to be one of the most moving ceremonies that we as men share at Webb. Since the passing of the ball could get a little hectic, I thought it would be a good idea to switch to using a rock from the bottom of the canyon, because people are less likely to throw a rock back and forth. And a rock from the bottom, had a certain symbolism. You all partook of this tradition the other night, and I hope that you found it as moving as I always do. And I hope that it sealed your unity as a class and as a group of friends. Because of your experiences together, many of you have developed friendships that will last a lifetime. Safeguard those friendships, just like you took care of each other on the trail. Earlier I mentioned that I am not exactly sure what the motivation was for the decision to have this arduous hike into and out of the Grand Canyon as the culmination of the Webb experience. But I would venture to guess. It's about something called a Rite of Passage. A Rite of Passage is some activity that an individual within a social group undertakes that results in a transition from one stage of life to another. There are societies in many parts of the world where changes in life status are marked by incredibly rich ceremonies, often consisting of challenges to be faced in order for an initiate to transcend to the next level. Unfortunately, in the modern world, there are few meaningful rites of passage. Rites of passage often involve journeys marked by physical or spiritual challenges, or both. I think what you guys just experienced was a rite of passage. I no longer consider you to be boys, but I think of you now as young men, and it is up to you to decide what kind of man each of you wants to be. You all know good men who have been part of your lives, including the teachers who just led you on this journey. They are men of character and are great examples of mentors to follow in life, especially when things get tough. Most of them are not saints or heroes, and I would venture to say that they might have flaws in some way, but as good men, they struggle to do the right things in life, much as you did to climb the walls of that canyon. When you hiked the canyon, how many of you slipped or stumbled? In life, you all will slip, and sometimes you will stumble and make wrong decisions. As Mr. Caldwell stated the other night, if you are truthful with yourselves, it's easier to make the right decisions. Faced with what seemed like endless switchbacks, how many of you doubted your ability to continue on, but overcame your doubt simply by carrying on? How many of you reassured another hiker who was struggling more than you, or encouraged someone with a kind word, or helped another on the trail and found that it somehow made your load feel lighter? As men throughout life, we will always be works in progress. Work at being good leaders, good mates, and good fathers. Take the experiences, examples, and knowledge that you have learned at Webb and put them to good purpose. Throughout your lives, especially, rekindle the Grand Canyon memories and lessons learned from the hike, for they will serve you well. As you continue your new endeavors, I wish you the best too. So take care. Thank you.